Alright, here we go in the last part of our connective tissue, muscle tissue, and neural tissue. So we're going to get into the muscle and neural tissue in this last video for part 3. So muscle tissue, I think also one of the easiest to identify and understand what their purposes are, is basically muscle tissue specialized for contractions of movement of body parts, whether it be locomotion of the entire body, movement of individual structures, or for internal movement of substances. For example, your cardiac muscle tissue is going to contract to move blood throughout your body, and then you also have smooth muscle tissue, which contracts in various instances to either control the size of blood vessels or to push or move substances through your intestines, or secretion of glands or ducts or things like that. So muscle tissue serves various functions besides the obvious things that you've learned throughout time that all your skeletal muscle does. This contraction, as a result of the energy being used to contract muscles, you actually end up with the production of heat. So what's nice about that is it actually functions to keep your body warm. Muscle also protects internal body structures. This isn't a direct necessarily function, as it is just a function as to how they happen to be located. So you can look at it as though your muscle sometimes protects your bones from injury, and your muscle can surround other kind of soft tissue within there. So let's look at some of the functions and examples. So you have three main types of muscle tissue. You have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Looking at the examples here, so just in the body, smooth muscle, again, look, surrounding the stomach, which is an organ that has to move substances throughout the body. Smooth muscle, very, very different structure, meaning it has a completely different function, but still fits in the same category as the other types of muscle tissue. You have skeletal muscle tissue, which you'll notice differences between these two. You have these vertical lines, which we'll get into in a second, multiple nuclei, only one nuclei here. Then you have cardiac muscle tissue, again a different type of structure, single nuclei, has these vertical lines again, defining characteristics that makes each of them different, and we'll get into each of those right now. Skeletal muscle tissue is obviously the most common. It's what you think of when you think of muscles themselves, but they are always found connected to bones for some kind of voluntary movement. Keep in mind, though, some skeletal muscle can be controlled involuntary. Defining characteristics of skeletal muscle tissue is they're marked with a series of what are called striations or bands. So if you think of this pen as your skeletal muscle cell moving in this direction, the striations or bands are going to move up and down in a perpendicular direction to the actual muscle fiber itself. Those striations are a defining characteristic of them, on top of being multinucleated, and it's actually also by being multinucleated, has a very, very, very large amount of mitochondria within there. Also, they are tightly packed together, so the fibers lay one on top of another in the same direction or parallel direction. Here would be an example of all your skeletal muscles. When we get into the muscular unit, you are actually going to memorize a significant number of these muscles, but not all of them. We're going to memorize major muscle groups and their location throughout the body. Okay. Here's what skeletal muscle tissue would look like under a microscope. It's a very, very obvious identification, in my opinion. So what you see is each one of these pink bands that runs in these directions. Those are the actual muscle fibers themselves. So this would be a muscle fiber or a single. And I'm not very good at drawing, so we're gonna ignore that. Actually, let's erase all of those. Okay. We'll just try this one more time. That one was better. Let's try this one. Oh yeah. So this would be one muscle cell. Things you're going to want to point out. These things right here, these dark things right here, and right here, and right here, and right here, and right here. This whole entire structure is one muscle cell. All of these little green things that I've so poorly highlighted out to you, those are all the nuclei for one cell. So you'll notice that it is multinucleated. Another function, you're going to notice that there are striations. So you see all these lines that run in this direction like this. Those are the striations. Defining characteristics: fibers tightly packed together, striations, multinucleated. Unbelievable stuff. So let's get into question number 5 real quick. Since we just talked about skeletal muscle tissue, why do you suppose it is necessary for skeletal muscle tissue to have multiple nuclei within one cell and also have an abundance of mitochondria. I would like for you to explain that to me. Alright, so let's get into cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is found only in the heart, hence the name cardiac muscle tissue. It is an involuntary contraction or movement. So basically, the contractions you cannot consciously control. As you sit here, you cannot tell your heart to beat faster. You have to have some kind of stimuli that requires the heart to beat faster or move blood in an increased volume. So, defining characteristic, it is also striated just like skeletal muscle tissue, but instead, each of the cardiac muscle cells are significantly smaller than skeletal, and they only have usually one nuclei. It also looks as though it branches in different directions, whereas the skeletal muscle tissue look like my fingers right here. All the muscle fibers or cells run parallel. Cardiac muscle tissue would be like if you were to cross your fingers. They overlap, almost looking like they're branching. Keeping in mind, they are involuntary, found only in the heart. So believe it or not, your heart is a muscle. So all of this, if we did an analysis of the tissue, you would find that it looks as though it is cardiac muscle tissue, very different than skeletal muscle tissue. Here's a diagram of what it looks like. So if you look, branching effect. Each one of these darkened circles, those are going to be the nuclei. And if you notice these vertical lines, those are the striations. And you see how there's spacing between the actual muscle fibers or muscle cells, whereas in skeletal muscle they were one packed on top of another on top of another. This is the defining characteristic, that if you were looking at two different slides of skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, you'll notice that there are these things called intercalated discs in cardiac muscle tissue. So if we're looking at this diagram right here, you will see that intercalated discs actually form right here, right here. There are these really darkened looking lines that run perpendicular to the actual fibers themselves. If you'll notice that there's a single nuclei for each of them, and you have this branching or kind of weave effect to all of the different cells within cardiac muscle tissue. Here's another example here. This one most closely resembles the one that we had in class, but if you're looking at it again, you will notice that here's an intercalated disc. Here's an intercalated disc, large nuclei, single, has a branching effect. So if you see how these branch in this direction, branching, so much branching. So, question number 6. Which of the following is the defining differences between skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue? Is it A, striations, B, intercalated discs, C, cell arrangement, D, none of the above, E, all of the above, or F, B, and C? Yes, that is an annoying question. So let's get into smooth muscle, the last of the 3 different types of muscular tissue. So smooth muscle is found in the walls of your blood vessels, your intestine, uterus, urinary bladder, reproductive tract. These are used for involuntary responses also. So you can consciously control some of the muscles within these, but anything you can't control, tell your blood vessels to contract. You can't tell your intestines to move food throughout, but they kind of do that job for them. The cells are significantly smaller than either cardiac or in fact skeletal. They're very slender and tapered, meaning they come to points at each end. So you have a rounded middle section that comes down to a point on each end. It would look very similar to what you would see in this diagram right here. Think of it like an eye. Your eye comes to points on each end, right here, and it's tapered, meaning coming down to those points on each end. Like I said, the cells are small, one nucleus, and they are non-striated, meaning they don't have those perpendicular lines. Most of the time, people are going to confuse cardiac muscle tissue with some type of fibrous connective tissue, but it is not. I will outline the cells for you real quick, or I'll try my best to. What you'll notice is you find a nuclei right here, and you will notice that there's one right here, here's one right here, here's one right here, but if I outlined this one here, you'll notice that it comes to a tapered end on each. That you don't see as many nuclei because each cell only has one nuclei. Here, if you're looking at, this is an even better picture. Do not pay attention to the bottom section here. This is not smooth muscle. However, up here is smooth muscle. So if you take this cell right here, which is the most obvious example, you will notice it has a single nuclei, tapered edges to it. Here's another one. Sorry, I'm not the best drawer. Alright, the last kind, and then we're done with part 3 notes, and essentially you're done with all video notes for this unit unless you have to review some of your tissue identification. Neural tissue, we will get more into this also when we go into the nervous system, but basically nervous tissue is completely specialized for communication, control, and integration of all your body's functions. That whole feedback loop, those lines you would draw from a receptor to the control center, from the control center to the effector, those lines essentially would represent nervous tissue in some way, shape, or form. It has very, very, very low regeneration abilities. This is why if you break your, if you snap your spine, that's why people become paralyzed, because you don't have the ability to regenerate nervous tissue or repair it. Most of your nervous tissue is concentrated in your brain and spinal cord. That's your central nervous system, but it can branch out into the peripheral nervous system also. Here's a diagram. No, you will not have to memorize any of the nerves for this class. Not an easy task, and that's more something that should be tackled in your college level anatomy physiology class. Here's your central nervous system, comprising of your brain and your spinal cord, and that's where most of your nervous tissue is actually concentrated. Functions and examples. So you essentially have two types of cells for nervous tissue. You have neurons and what are called neuroglia. Neurons are the ones that actually do the communication and the sending of signals to and from your brain and spinal cord that actually control or integrate or respond to body functions or stimuli. And then you have neuroglial cells, which are those are the support cells. They help maintenance and minor repairs, nutrients, and they protect neurons. So they actually can keep them nice and safe and snuggly. If you look at a diagram of nervous tissue, you will notice all of these really giant pink cells. Those are the actual neurons, and then they branch out in various directions. Those will either be axons or dendrites, depending on the type of cell or the type of nervous tissue or where it's located. If you're looking at an actual microscope slide, you will notice that this is the neuron itself, and all these little blue dots around it, those are the neuroglial cells. And all of these little branches, those are all interconnecting dendrites or axons of other neurons. Another example here, all the black dots represented around this are neuroglial cells. This is a neuron, really large, darkened nucleus, and you will notice they have axons and dendrites that branch out in all kinds of numerous directions. And that is the end of our tissue notes. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, best of luck to you. I love you.